The way the people closest to you treated you was never random. And it was never because you lacked something. It happened for a reason most people never talk about. A reason no one explained to you while it was happening. They didn't treat you that way because you were weak. They treated you that way because you carried something they couldn't name, couldn't access, and couldn't control. From the moment you entered a room, there was a presence about you. Not loud, not dominant, not desperate for attention. Quiet, rooted, unshakable. You didn't announce yourself. You didn't perform. You didn't need validation. And that's exactly what made people uncomfortable. Because presence like that doesn't compete. It doesn't beg. It doesn't explain itself. It simply exists. And the people who felt it the most weren't strangers. They weren't outsiders. They were the ones closest to you. Strangers can ignore your energy. Acquaintances can admire it from a safe distance. But friends and family, they're close enough to compare. Close enough to feel the contrast every single day. And when someone is operating from insecurity, ego, or unresolved pain, that contrast doesn't inspire them. It threatens them. Not because you're trying to outshine anyone, people, but because your existence quietly reminds them of what they avoided becoming. You carried a calm resilience, a confidence that didn't need applause, a kindness that didn't come from weakness but from depth. And the truth is, that kind of energy can't be taught. It can't be bought. It can't be faked. It's something you're born with. Something that grows when you stay lined with who you are. And that's why it bothered them. No one ever sat you down and explained this. No one told you why the tone changed. Why jokes started carrying an edge. Why support slowly turned into subtle criticism? They never said it out loud. They showed it in small ways. In dismissive comments, in backhanded compliments, in moments where they should have defended you, but chose silence instead. And it wasn't because they hated you. It was because they didn't know how to sit with what you represented. Here's something most people never understand. A system that benefits from yourself. Doubt will never remind you of your worth. An environment that profits from your generosity will never encourage boundaries. And people who rely on feeling superior will never help you realize your potential. Because the moment you fully step into who you are, the entire dynamic collapses. They sense that if you ever stopped shrinking, stopped over explaining, stopped over giving, they would lose their position in your life. They would lose access. They would lose control. They would lose the advantage, and that scared them. You operated from sincerity. You didn't see people as competition. You didn't rank yourself above or below anyone. You met people where they were, and ironically, that openness made you an easy target. Because those who operate from ego mistake kindness for weakness. They assume calm means compliant. They assume forgiveness means forgetfulness. They assume silence means control. So they pushed. They tested, they crossed lines. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. They wanted to see how much you would tolerate. How far they could go before you reacted. how much they could take before you changed. And every time you chose grace over chaos, it confused them. They expected you to break. They expected you to dim. They expected you to become smaller so they could feel bigger. But that never happened. Yes, they hurt you. And yes, there were moments you felt it deeply. Moments where you questioned yourself. Moments where you wondered if maybe you were the problem. But every single time, you found your way back to center. You healed quietly. You rebuilt privately. You regained your joy without making noise. And that's when the energy shifted. Because now, people, instead of seeing you as someone they could control, they began to see you as someone they could not stop. They watched you grow. They watched you detach. They watched you glow without asking for approval. And something inside them cracked. The same people who once overlooked you now watched you closely. The same people who minimized you now analyzed your every move. Some of them wake up and the first thing they do is check what you're doing. Not because they care, but because you remind them of everything they avoided becoming. You represent effort, alignment, self-respect. And when someone is stuck in a life they secretly resent, your progress becomes a mirror they can't look away from. They know they treated you badly. They know they underestimated you. And they know that bridge is burned. That's why the energy feels different now. You don't chase closure. You don't demand apologies. You don't explain yourself, you disengage. Silence became your boundary. Distance became your protection. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. You understood something that changed everything. Access to you is a privilege, not a right. The version of you they once had access to no longer exists. And even if you see them in passing, you don't confront, you don't react, you don't reopen doors. You choose a different path, a different direction, a different life. And that silence speaks louder than anything you could ever say. This isn't revenge. This isn't ego. This is alignment. When you outgrow environments built on imbalance, separation becomes inevitable. And when you finally choose yourself, the people who benefited from your self-neglect will always feel uncomfortable. Here's the part most people never talk about. For a long time, you were the stabilizer. You absorbed tension so others didn't have to face it. You kept the peace. You softened the room, people. You made excuses for behavior that never deserved justification. And while you thought you were being loving, what you were really doing was delaying your own awakening. The people closest to you grew comfortable in that arrangement. They grew used to you being understanding while they stayed unchanged. They grew used to you being patient while they avoided responsibility. They grew used to you being forgiving while repeating the same patterns. And unconsciously, they built an identity around the idea that you would always be there to catch the fallout. So when you stopped, when you quietly stepped back, when you chose clarity over chaos, it didn't feel like growth to them. It felt like betrayal. Not because you wronged them, but because you disrupted a system that benefited them. Some reacted with confusion, some with anger, some with silence. and some tried to guilt you back into your old role. They questioned your character. They reframed the story. They called you cold. They said you changed. What they really meant was, you're no longer predictable. And unpredictability threatens people who need control to feel safe. You did change. You became aware. You became selective. You became grounded. You stopped pouring into containers with holes in the bottom. And once that happened, the roles reversed. Now they're watching from the outside. Now they're curious. Now they're wondering how you became so calm, so focused, so unbothered. They don't see the nights you spent rebuilding yourself. They don't see the internal battles you fought alone. People. They don't see the discipline it took to choose silence over reaction. They only see the result. And results intimidate people who never did the work. What's important to understand is this. Not everyone who mistreated you did it consciously. Some were projecting unhealed pain. These civilized people, some were repeating cycles they never questioned. Some were operating from their level of awareness. And while that explains behavior, it does not excuse it. Growth doesn't require resentment, but it does require boundaries. You learned that love without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. That loyalty without discernment becomes self-betrayal. That being understanding does not mean tolerating disrespect. And you learn those lessons the hard way, through disappointment, through silence, through watching the same patterns repeat until you finally chose yourself. These civilized people, that's why you don't feel the need to go back and fix things. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're done because the version of you that once over-explained, overgave, and overlooked red flags no longer exists. That version served its purpose, but it cannot go where you're going next. And here's what most people never tell you. The moment you stop trying to explain yourself, the moment you stop defending your intentions, the moment you stopped proving your heart, that's when the shift became permanent. Because the second you withdrew your energy, the imbalance became obvious. The dynamic no longer worked. People who relied on your availability, your empathy, your emotional labor suddenly felt exposed. You see, for a long time you were the stabilizer. You were the one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to face it. People, you were the one who kept things calm when they became uncomfortable. You were the one who softened situations that should have forced accountability. And you didn't do it for praise. You did it because you genuinely cared. But while you thought you were being loving, you were unknowingly teaching people that your needs were optional. These civilized people, the people closest to you, grew comfortable in that arrangement. They grew used to you being understanding why. Well, they stayed unchanged. They grew used to you being patient while they avoided responsibility. They grew used to you being forgiving while repeating the same patterns. And without realizing it, they built an idea around the idea that you would always be there to absorb the impact. So when you stopped, when you quietly stepped back, when you chose clarity over chaos, it didn't register as growth to them. It felt like betrayal. Not because you harmed them, not because you abandoned them, but because you disrupted a system that worked in their favor. That's why the reactions were so intense. Some responded with confusion, others with anger. Some went silent. And a few tried to guilt you back into your old role. They questioned your character. They reframed the story. They painted you as cold, distant, changed. But what they really meant was simple. You're no longer predictable. These civilized people, and unpredictability is terrifying to people who need control to feel safe. You did change. You became aware. You became selective. You became grounded. You stopped pouring into containers that leaked no matter how much you gave. And once that happened, the power dynamic flipped. Now they were on the outside looking in. Now they were watching instead of influencing. Now they were wondering how you became so calm, so focused people, so unbothered. They don't see the nights you spent rebuilding yourself. They don't see the conversations you had with yourself in silence. They don't see the discipline it took to choose restraint over reaction. They only see the result. And results intimidate people who never did the work. What's important to understand is this. Not everyone who mistreated you did it consciously. Some were projecting unhealed pain. Some were repeating patterns they never questioned. Some were operating at the limit of their awareness. That explains behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. Growth doesn't require resentment, but it does require boundaries. You learn something most people never learn. That love without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. That loyalty without discernment becomes self-betrayal. That understanding does not mean tolerating disrespect. And you didn't learn those lessons from books. You learned them from experience, from disappointment, people, from watching the same cycles repeat, until something inside you finally said, enough. That's why you don't feel the need to go back and fix things. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're complete, because the version of you that once over-explained, over-gave, pull and ignored red flags no longer exists. That version got you here, but it cannot go where you're going next. And here's something else that happens when you step into alignment. Life responds quickly. When you stop leaking energy, when you honor your intuition, when you protect your peace, clarity sharpens, opportunities appear without force, your presence changes. People feel it before they understand it. People. That's why some of the same people who doubted you now seek your approval. That's why some who ignored you now watch you closely. That's why some suddenly want to reconnect without addressing the past. But silence remains your answer. Not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself enough to protect your peace. You understand now that not every chapter needs closure. Not every connection deserves continuation. And not every apology changes behavior. Sometimes the most powerful response is distance. Sometimes the loudest statement is absence. And the people who truly respect you understand that without explanation. You're operating on a different frequency now, a quieter one, a stronger one that doesn't need to announce itself, one that doesn't seek validation. You move differently. You listen more than you speak. You observe before you engage. You choose who has access to your energy. Civilized people. And because of that, your presence is no longer available for manipulation. That's the real reason the people closest to you treated you badly. They sensed your potential before you claimed it. They felt your depth before you owned it. And insecure systems always react the same way. When they feel change approaching, they try to suppress it. But suppression never works on someone who is meant to rise. People, if you're listening to this and something inside you feels seen, understand this. You were never imagining things. Your awareness is sharpening because you're ready for the next level of yourself. The discomfort you experience wasn't punishment. It was preparation. There is nothing wrong with you for outgrowing people. There is nothing cold about choosing peace. And there is nothing selfish about protecting your energy. You're not here to be consumed. You're here to become. And the moment you fully accepted that, everything began to change. Here's a truth most people don't want to hear. If they had treated you well back then, if they had supported you fully, if they had respected your boundaries from the start, you might have stayed. You might have remained comfortable. You might have never questioned the imbalance. Sometimes mistreatment is the catalyst. Sometimes rejection is redirection. And sometimes being misunderstood is exactly what forces you to understand yourself. You didn't lose people. You lost illusions. You lost the version of them you believed would show up when it mattered. These civilized people, the version that would protect you the way you protected them. And while that realization hurt, it also freed you. Because once the illusion breaks, you stop expecting depth from shallow places. You stop seeking safety from those who are unsafe. You stop asking for understanding from people who refuse to look inward. That's maturity. That's discernment. It didn't come from comfort. It came from contrast. You can see patterns clearly now. You notice who only feels confident when you're doubting yourself. You notice who celebrates you publicly, but competes with you internally. You notice who listens to respond and who listens to understand. And because of that awareness, your tolerance for misalignment has dropped to 0. Not because you're harsh, but because you're honest. And honesty changes everything. It changes who you allow into your space. It changes how much you share. It changes how quickly you detect when something feels off. You no longer wait for disrespect to become obvious. You trust the subtle signs. The tone shifts. The energy changes. The lack of reciprocity. The discomfort you once ignored, you now acknowledge. That's growth. And with growth comes solitude, not loneliness. Solitude. Loneliness feels empty. Solitude feels clearer. In solitude, you hear yourself again. You reconnect with your intuition. You realize how much noise you were surrounded by. How many opinions shaped your decisions? How much of your energy was pulled in directions that never aligned with your purpose? Now things are quieter. And in that quiet, you're building something real. You're building self-trust. You're building discernment. You're building a life that doesn't require constant explanation. And the people meant to meet you at this level will recognize you without effort. There will be no confusion, no power struggles, no need to dim or perform or prove. The connection will feel mutual, stable, clean. Until then, you're comfortable standing alone, because standing alone no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like alignment. People. The people who treated you badly were never meant to walk this part of the journey with you. These civilized people, they were part of the lesson, not the destination. And once you stopped trying to drag them forward, once you stopped waiting for them to catch up, your path cleared, momentum returned. These civilized people, your focus sharpened, your energy stabilized. You stopped leaking power into places that didn't nourish you. And as a result, life began responding differently. Doors opened without force. Confusion dissolved. Peace became your default state instead of something you had to fight for. People. This is what happens when you choose yourself consistently. Not once, not occasionally, but every day. And here's the final truth to understand. People don't mistreat those they respect. They mistreat those they believe will tolerate it. The moment you stop tolerating it, the moment you withdrew access, the moment you chose silence over explanation, everything changed. Not because you became cold, but because you became clear. So if you've been questioning why certain people fell away, why familiar faces no longer feel familiar, why connections dissolved, trust the process. You didn't lose your way. You found it. And the peace you feel now, even if it's quiet, unfamiliar, or empty at times, that peace is proof you're no longer betraying yourself to keep others comfortable. Protect it. Build from it. Because the life you're stepping into requires a different version of you. A grounded one, an aware one, a self-respecting one. And you're already becoming that person. One boundary at a time, one choice at a time, one quiet moment of self-honor at a time. Stay steady. Stay aligned. And never forget this. You were never mistreated because you were weak. You were mistreated because you were powerful. And they sensed it long before you did.